Every puzzle has an answer.
After arriving at a Roman-style Colosseum and defeating a demon beast with 3 other failures, Subaru, now a child, having been transformed and physically weakened, must find a way to escape the arena. But escaping won't be easy. Every guard in the Colosseum commands witch beasts, just like the lion that took him hundreds of tries to defeat. Even if he manages to take down all of those creatures with the help of the other prisoners, it wouldn't matter because the Colosseum's owner, the governor, has a curse that activates the moment a revolt breaks out among the gladiators. As if that weren't enough, Subaru must also face off against an enemy backed by the second strongest person in the country. Welcome to the third part of Subaru Natsuki's impossible escape. During his flight, he's accused of a crime he didn't commit. He also realizes the limits of his broken power. In this final chapter, he'll have to face a future that seems impossible to avoid. Ever since Subaru infiltrated the governor's office to learn his plans, he knew the moment would come when he could no longer save everyone from his save point. He knew this because he had died many times before while trying to sneak in and stay unnoticed. The first time he died, he could return to where the messengers from the capital had just arrived. However, once he began infiltrating the office, the save point shifted, locking him inside the room. With each death, he could feel ruin creeping ever closer. From the moment Gustav died, Subaru understood that he couldn't afford to die again. If he did, death would be final, and he would be the only one to blame. If he could fix everything without letting his allies die, there might still be a chance to save them. But that was just a fantasy. By now, the sheer number of times Subaru had died was proof enough that a future without more death was already out of reach. How many times had he died by now? Subaru asked himself this as he recalled how this current save point began with Tanza screaming as she was thrown into the void. Just as he finished that thought, he heard Hyane call out his name, right before Todd struck him with his axe. Due to his weakness, Subaru was in shock and failed to pull Idra out of the enemy's range. Now, Idra was dead too, lying in a corner next to Hyane. Todd looked at Subaru, preparing to ask if he was the Emperor's son. This time, Subaru interrupted, finishing the question for him. Todd remarked how creepy it was that Subaru could predict his words. Seeing that his enemy was being cautious, Subaru immediately told Todd that if he didn't want to die, he'd better not move. Then he pulled out the black orb, the one that could kill everyone present the moment it was activated. Todd tried to reason with him, but Subaru cut him off, saying that he was the only one allowed to speak. If Todd wanted to stay alive, he had to stay silent. Had he not heard him clearly? Todd looked like he was about to explode with rage. Instead, he simply said he understood and dropped his weapons to the ground. Subaru was taken aback by how easily Todd surrendered. Todd then commented on how strange Subaru was acting. Wasn't this exactly what he wanted? Subaru felt regret. He had chosen the easy route by pretending to be the Emperor's son. If he had used the black orb as a shield from the start, none of this would have happened. None of his friends would have been killed. Then, Todd asked him if he knew how to use the orb. Subaru hesitated for a moment, and that was all Todd needed to see through the bluff. In the blink of an eye, Todd kicked the orb out of Subaru's hand, sending it flying down the hallway. Subaru instinctively turned his head to follow the orb's path, but doing so in front of a deadly enemy was asking to die. He heard something rushing toward him with incredible force. As he braced himself for the end, he admitted one thing: there was no way he could stop Todd. A fool who lost everything trying to be a good man, only to become the target of ridicule. Those around Idra Masanga described him that way, as a man who lost the family business, ended up on the streets, and eventually became a slave. Idra lived in a small farming village in the northern part of the empire. His grandfather had been tasked with building the town's water wheel and grinding its grain. He then became in charge of running the local mill. Thanks to that, the Masanga family came to enjoy a great deal of economic prestige. Idra's grandfather taught his children the importance of conducting honest business and working hard to earn the trust of others. Both Idra's parents and Idra himself lived by that philosophy. It wasn't unusual for the Masangas to help the village during times of crisis, often taking on duties that should have fallen to the village chief. The Masangas never tried to monopolize their business. They shared as much as they could, which was far from the norm in the empire. A place where the strong crushed the weak. When Idra inherited the business, he made sure to continue those family traditions. One day, after a long day of work, he met a strange man at the town bar, a warrior who visited from time to time. The man told him stories about the world beyond the village. It was a world ruled by war, and, truth be told, it sounded thrilling. Until then, Idra had never seriously considered other possibilities for his life. Soon, however, he found himself daydreaming about becoming a noble warrior. However, he knew that was no longer an option. After all, a true warrior wouldn't waste his life as a boring village miller. Time passed, and the strange man eventually confessed that he had taken an interest in Idra's cousin. Idra welcomed the news and even arranged a meeting between them. Before long, he was paying for their wedding drinks. But a month later, the conspiracy began. The man accused the Masanga family of forging documents to exclude Idra's cousin from the family inheritance. Idra denied everything, of course, but he couldn't easily dispel the doubts that came with such a serious accusation. Then his father, who had already passed the mill down to him because he was ill, died. Not long after, his mother died as well, as if unable to bear life without her husband. Idra was devastated. Still, he was determined to clear his name and restore his family's honor. He believed the villagers would support him when the time came to testify. After all, the Masanga family had always stood up for them. However, when the trial arrived, no one answered his call for help. Idra swore he was innocent, but no one believed him. Even worse, someone had planted fake evidence in his home, making it seem like he was organizing a popular uprising against the village chief. The village lord stripped him of his property and inheritance. Idra was then sold into slavery and sent to Gladiator Island. In that place, where fighting for one's life was nothing more than a public spectacle, Idra felt his heart crumble and his soul rot. He chose to sink deeper into despair. Hadn't he suffered enough already? How could he stay motivated to work hard when he had given so much and received nothing in return? Everything he believed in was a lie. Everything he trusted had been a mistake. Everyone was just looking to take advantage of others and save themselves. If that was how the world worked, then there was nothing wrong with him doing the same. Idra was nothing. He was no one. Of course, no one would choose him. He had no training, no special skills that made him useful. Who would choose someone like him? Not even Idra would choose Idra. Who would choose Idra? Someone who was honest to the core. Was there anyone out there who would choose someone like that?
戦士になりたかったんだろ、イドラ。だったら今だ。今がその時なんだよ。
The day he fell into despair was the very day he would be rewarded for living an honest life, even though he had already resigned himself to the belief that such a day would never come. Idra's head felt strange, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. Although he could still feel his limbs, they felt oddly disconnected from the rest of his body. He remembered freezing in fear as he watched whites die and Tanza get thrown into the void. In a way, it was ironic that his own cowardice had allowed him to outlive them. Was the humiliation he now felt in his chest the result of his inaction? The despair and regret overwhelming him in that moment far surpassed anything he had ever experienced, even greater than when his family business was taken from him. Idra reflected on his life and realized that he had lived a full and beautiful one. Perhaps it was that very life that had provoked the envy of the warrior who stole it all away. Either way, he knew he would never forgive that bastard. As he breathed heavily and his vision blurred, he heard Todd approach someone. He knew who Todd was heading toward, and he was grateful that the man's target was close by. Then, his vision cleared just enough to make out a small, bloodied child in rags dragging himself along the floor. Todd had already passed Idra, likely assuming he was dead. Maybe if Idra stayed down, the man with the axe would continue to ignore him and unintentionally spare his life. Then, maybe Idra could survive on his own. The man was closing in on the child, and the moment of choice had arrived. Would he choose to be cunning and strong, willing to do anything to survive? Or would he remain a foolishly honest man whom others could trust? What kind of person would he choose to be? As the boy's end approached, Idra pressed his face into the dirt. What could he possibly save by hiding his face like that? Then, he screamed and shouted, "No!" He forced his body to move, coughing up blood in the process. Unable to move his left arm, he used his right to clutch the man's body and try to bite him. Todd immediately said he knew the man was still alive. He dropped his axe, turned around, and drew a knife. He used the knife to slice off Idra's right arm. Blood from the severed arm painted Idra's vision red. Instead of succumbing to the pain, he screamed once more into the void and shouted, "Take him and get him out of here!" Todd instantly realized the lizard man was still alive. As he watched Subaru being dragged away by something invisible, Todd hurled his knife into the air. The knife didn't hit anyone, but for some reason, it stopped in midair just as Subaru disappeared from his sight. Left alone with Idra, Todd unleashed his fury. He drove an elbow into Idra's chest, slamming him into the ground. The force of the impact miraculously popped the bone in Idra's left hand back into place. That miracle wasn't alone. Idra had fallen right where Todd had dropped his axe. Idra grabbed the weapon, stood up, and looked at Todd once more. Todd asked if he really thought Subaru had escaped. Idra replied that that wasn't what he was thinking. He was really thinking about Hyain, that good-hearted but cowardly lizard, and how he hadn't expected him to leave him alone with Todd. Idra thought he couldn't blame him. After all, even after everything he'd been through and all the misfortunes in his life, Idra had chosen to remain an honest man. In the end, people don't change so easily. When he arrived at the Colosseum, he tried to deceive those around him by pretending to be a warrior, but his lie was quickly exposed. He had forgotten that he needed to be honest and earn everyone's trust, even if it meant being mocked for being good. Idra Misanga knew that, at that moment, he was neither a warrior nor a liar. Gripping the axe with his blood-soaked left hand, he shouted, "I'm Idra Misanga, the miller's son." Todd simply replied that he'd never heard of that family. Mustering every last ounce of strength, Idra charged at the man with the emotionless face. He was glad Subaru hadn't let him become a liar the day they met. Subaru could barely stay conscious. He didn't know where he was, but he could tell that someone was carrying him. The person carrying him was rough, making the ride anything but comfortable. However, Subaru knew this wasn't the time to complain. He tried to muster the strength to lift himself up. When he looked at Hyain, he realized he was a complete mess. He couldn't even maintain the appearance of blending in with his surroundings. In fact, every part of his body was poorly camouflaged. Suddenly, the person carrying him lost strength and collapsed. As a result, the boy fell hard onto the ground and broke a tooth. He turned to look at his companion and saw that he was in worse shape than he had imagined. Not only was Hyain a wreck, but he also had a knife lodged deep in the center of his back. Idra's voice and Hyain's breathing grew fainter. Soon, the two of them, along with White's, would be in a place he could never reach again. Then, out of nowhere, Hyain spoke, saying how strange it all was. He'd once heard that life always chooses the prettiest flowers first, so he didn't understand why it would pick someone as messed up as him. He said this with great difficulty. It seemed like he'd lost so much blood that speaking was barely possible. Subaru begged him not to talk anymore as he dragged himself toward Hyain. He wanted to stop him from speaking since every word clearly brought him pain. Desperate to keep him from choking on his own blood, he hurried toward him, but his body could only move at a turtle's pace. Suddenly, he heard Hyain whisper that maybe it was better if he was the one to go first. By the time Subaru reached Hyain's side, it was too late. Hyain's body had returned to its normal color. Now that he could see him clearly, Subaru wondered if Hyain had been dying when he ran to get him away from danger. He probably was. After all, Hyain had been running with a large knife in his back, a broken arm, and blood pouring out of his body. They all died trying to save Subaru, yet he hadn't been able to save any of them. That made him just as responsible for their deaths as Todd was. Was it blood, tears, or snot dripping down his face? He no longer knew what was what, who he was, or what the answer was. He simply didn't understand anything anymore. Suddenly, someone spoke to him, startling him as he saw someone standing there while he lay dying on the ground. It was Cecilis, who said he was glad things were getting interesting. Subaru tried to turn and look at him, but couldn't even manage that. Cecilis told him not to strain himself so much on a battlefield where death could come at any moment. As he said this, he stepped into Subaru's field of vision. Subaru then noticed that Cecilis's small body was half burned, yet he still smiled, carefree as ever. At this point, it was safe to say that only the crazy ones remained on the island. The only survivors were Cecilis, Arakiya, Todd, and Subaru. When the two boys met again, Cecilis cheerfully pointed out that Subaru looked like he'd had a rough time. He also remarked quite casually that all of Subaru's companions seemed to be dead. When Subaru refused to accept this, Cecilis added that he was surprised Subaru hadn't realized it himself. Subaru was bitter. He couldn't understand how Cecilis had figured it out and yet spoke so lightly about something so painful. Cecilis continued talking, saying that even though Hyain had died, his final expression didn't look half bad. It was the face of someone who died fulfilling their duty. He said he envied that and hoped he could one day leave this world the same way. He added that he'd like to keep chatting, but he was currently in the middle of a battle against a silver-haired girl. He said he was glad someone had finally shown up to stand in the way of his goal of reaching the sword of the heavens. Subaru asked why he seemed to be enjoying all of this. Cecilis corrected him, saying that he wasn't laughing because he enjoyed the situation. He was enjoying the situation because he was laughing, and because he knew someone was watching them. A being from beyond the stars, the observers. Cecilis simply didn't want to embarrass himself in front of them. Besides, he was the protagonist of this story. Of course he'd act however he pleased. After all, the script should follow him, not the other way around. Subaru didn't understand most of the boy's rambling, but he couldn't help but agree with him, at least a little. Then Sekulas abruptly cut himself off, saying it looked like their chat was over. At that moment, Arakiya appeared, no longer wearing her eye patch. The face that had once been devoid of emotion was now contorted with rage. The girl looked furious at Sekulas, but her anger didn't seem to stem from anything that had happened today. It felt like it came from something deeper. Casually waving his hand, Sekulas showed that he had stolen her eye patch. Before heading off to continue the fight, he told Subaru that he was free to either stay and burn to death or get moving. Suddenly, the girl's body ignited in flames, and wings sprouted from her back. The entire area around them started to catch fire. Even the remains of Hyaen began to smolder. Sekulas showed an unusually serious side when he remarked that one shouldn't treat the remains of someone who had fulfilled their purpose this way. But then, just as quickly, he returned to his usual self and threw himself into battle. Arakiya demanded to know why Sekulas looked the way he did, accusing him of toying with her. Sekulas had no idea what she was talking about. Frustrated, Arakiya said she was tired of everyone hiding things from her. Sekulas fired back, asking her why she was making a face like someone who had been left behind. As Subaru fled, he caught a glimpse of Arakiya merging with the flames and charging at Sekulas. At the same time, Sekulas transformed into a bolt of lightning and rushed to meet her head-on. Subaru was running, fleeing the scene. This wasn't a tactical retreat anymore. It was pure escape, a desperate attempt to survive. It was a life that had cost him his entire squad. Even though they had believed in him, he couldn't repay their trust by saving them. He cursed his own weakness and the fact that he couldn't be like Todd, someone who could accomplish his goals despite lacking authority. Because Subaru was incapable, people had died. Just as he began listing his shortcomings, he heard a noise. Fearing the worst, fearing it was Todd, Subaru turned toward the sound. It was Tanza. Her clothes were completely soaked. It looked like she had fallen into the surrounding lake. The way she walked made it clear that she was injured and had lost one of her horns. Considering the waters were filled with witch beasts, it wasn't surprising. She immediately expressed concern for him, saying she was relieved he was safe. However, the words had the opposite effect. Subaru's remaining strength gave out, and he collapsed to his knees. He was tired of falling short of everyone's expectations. Despite her own injuries, Tanza rushed toward him, asking him to get up. She also asked where Hein and Idra were. Subaru noticed she didn't mention whites. It made sense. He had died before she was separated from them. All Subaru could tell her was that they had died protecting him. Tanza understood and told him they needed to leave and find a place to hide. Subaru responded by saying it was pointless. They'd be found right away. The girl told him that their squad mates hadn't sacrificed their lives for that kind of resignation. Shaking her head, Tanza screamed in frustration at Subaru, who remained motionless. But her tearful plea didn't move him. Instead, it brought him a cold, twisted clarity. Indeed, Subaru, the one those three gladiators had risked their lives for, was utterly useless. In other words, he had let them die for nothing. He hadn't been able to meet their expectations. Even though he had gone so far as to lie and deceive them, it would have been better if they had never believed the lie that he was the Emperor's son. If only they hadn't believed it. Then, those three wouldn't have tried to die in his place. They risked everything for Natsuki Subaru, not the Emperor's heir. Now that he thought about it, he realized that he had deceived someone else with that same lie. He told Tanza that everything about him was fake, that he wasn't the Emperor's son. Yes, he was the son of a great man, but not the Emperor of the Empire. He braced himself, ready for Tanza to hate him, or maybe even kill him. Instead, though, the girl simply tried to help him up and walk beside him. She repeated that they needed to find a place to hide. Subaru asked if she'd heard what he just said. Tanza replied that she had, and repeated his words verbatim. Then she added that they would talk about it once they were safe. Subaru told her that he didn't understand. Since he wasn't the Emperor's son, there was no reason to help him. Therefore, there was simply no reason to save him. After all, it was pretending to be the Emperor's son that got those three killed. But the girl interrupted him and asked if he truly believed what he had just said. Did he really believe everything he had just said? Subaru pulled his hand away, but she stepped closer and looked him in the eyes as she repeated her question. Did he really think whites, Idra, and Hyaen risked their lives because of the lie he told at the beginning? The protagonist replied that of course they did it because he was the Emperor's son. Tanza said that while they all believed that, neither the tattooed man, the miller's son, nor the lizard man had risked their lives purely out of patriotism for the nation. If Subaru were truly the Emperor's illegitimate child, he would be known as an imperial prince. For those three, as people of the Empire, It would have been natural to try to protect him, but that only made sense if they felt deep devotion to the Empire. Why would they feel patriotic toward a nation that trampled their way of life? As a coward, Hayane tried to run and save himself. Whites, a weakling, fought to survive by outmaneuvering those around him. As a liar, Idra pretended to be someone he wasn't in order to gain control. None of them seemed like people he would naturally get along with, and yet the three of them shared something in common. In the end, despite everything, those three risked their lives to protect Subaru. They shielded him. They gave him the chance to escape. Why? Apparently, they believed that Subaru was the Emperor's illegitimate son. But what if that hadn't been the case? As if reading his mind, Tanza asked him that very question. She said that all of this happened because he had become close to them. He had genuine conversations with them. He tried to understand each of them. He truly became close to them. As Tanza spoke, looking him straight in the eye, Subaru still couldn't grasp this. He kept wondering what he could have possibly done to make those three give their lives for his sake. He didn't understand the reasons Tanza listed because he had always believed that trying to understand others was natural, not special. Reaching out to them like that didn't seem extraordinary to him. Tanza told him that she understood how they felt because she had also been saved by Yorna, a divine general. She said she was certain they felt the same way about him, and that was why they were willing to die for him. Subaru felt like she was exaggerating. He had met Yorna and knew she was the kindest woman in the Empire. The very idea of comparing himself to her felt like a disgrace to who she was. But how did Hayane, Whites, and Idra see their relationship with him? Subaru knew more about them than they realized. He had seen Hayane's self-loathing, the false accusations against Whites, and Idra's downfall. Because of that, he said he wanted to save them. Tanza replied that he already had, but Subaru said he meant something else. Still, he began to wonder if maybe she was right. Maybe he had saved their hearts. However, saving their hearts alone wasn't enough. He wanted to save the hearts and bodies of those who had been kind to him. If he couldn't do that, then he wasn't worthy of being his father's son. No, that reason no longer mattered. What mattered now was what he wanted. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. He didn't want things to end this way. He refused to accept a conclusion where he couldn't save anyone. He couldn't accept an ending where everyone had to sacrifice themselves. He couldn't accept it. Subaru summed up his thoughts with a single phrase.
あなたに負けたくないです。
Then from behind him and emerging from the smoke appeared his sworn enemy wielding an axe. With indifference, the man said, "I couldn't care less about winning or losing." Subaru had trouble recognizing Todd at first because he looked different. He had always seen Todd with a bandana on his head, but now it was gone and his orange hair hung loose. Todd complained that the boy had the luck of a demon, saying that the flames from the battle between the two monsters had slowed him down. Tanza told him not to take another step as she picked up a rock to throw at him. She might not be agile or in the best shape, but she could still use her superhuman strength to throw something that would hurt him. Todd complimented her, saying he was surprised she survived falling into the lake. He added that he wouldn't underestimate her resolve, as doing so might get him killed, as he held the spot where his bandana used to be. Subaru realized Idra's final attack must have torn the bandana from Todd's head. Tanza asked Todd what he was after. He simply said he wanted to go home. That's when Subaru cut in and said he would be the one talking from then on. His enemy replied that he had nothing to say to Subaru, who then asked if he was scared of a dying little boy. Surprisingly, Todd said yes. Of course, he was afraid of a boy who, despite being on the verge of death, still acted as if he had a plan. Subaru thought Todd was the kind of man who tried to do everything alone, using others as tools. Subaru, on the other hand, genuinely cared for others and sought mutual benefit. People like Todd irritated Subaru, especially those who didn't care about their allies. That's why he told Todd that he wouldn't lose to him. Todd answered that he didn't care if Subaru won as long as he died in the end. The protagonist responded that if he lost, it wouldn't just be his loss, it would be the loss of the entire squad. He immediately dropped to his knees. While Todd kept his eyes fixed on Tanza, Subaru, using his last bit of strength, muttered, as he braced himself for what was about to happen. Tanza and Todd stood frozen and stunned by his words. In the past, whenever Subaru had said those words, breaking the taboo of his power, time would stop and shadows would appear to inflict unimaginable pain on him. But now, none of that happened. This was because the witch, or rather, the entity that governed his power, had lost contact with him. He remembered how his power had behaved strangely during the fight against Olbart, how it had failed him in his first Colosseum battle, and how it had spiraled out of control during this massacre. Those moments all had something in common. some discrepancy that Subaru couldn't explain but could definitely feel. Just as a fish wouldn't forget how to swim, Subaru hadn't forgotten how to use his authority. He was now certain that he had lost his connection to the witch, so he kept repeating those forbidden words, louder and louder. He didn't try to hide them from Tanza or Todd. He didn't hope that someone on the island would hear them. He was calling out to someone far above it all, someone who had always been with him. Subaru was reaching out to that someone who was always watching him, just as the Watchers had always watched Cecilus. It was this that had held him back from shouting at Cecilus when he talked about beings beyond the stars. Now more than ever, Subaru was sure the witch couldn't see him anymore. If she could see him, his save points would be filled with love, not despair. He continued speaking.
俺は死に戻りし顔してる。俺はここにいる。俺を見つけてくれ。虫のいい話なのはわかってる。でも、みんなを助けたいんだ。俺の、夏希、スバルの権能だけじゃ足りないんだ。だから、見つけてくれ。さてら。
愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。
Suddenly, the world lost all color and everything around him stopped, including Subaru, who could only watch out of the corner of his eye as someone approached and embraced him from behind. He heard whispered words of love in his ear. Once the witch settled against his back, she reached through his chest with her fingers. Not violently and without drawing blood, she sought to gently caress his heart. Now that she was finally where she wanted to be, Subaru thought that even if the world were consumed by this power, he would not be destroyed. Suddenly, time resumed. Todd and Tanza still couldn't grasp what Subaru meant when he said he can return by death, but they didn't have time to dwell on it because out of nowhere, strange howls began echoing throughout the area. All the witch beasts in the area stopped what they were doing and began howling in unison, as if they had been practicing for this moment. Todd didn't understand why this was happening, but he deduced that Subaru was somehow the cause. Determined to put an end to it, he attacked. Without hesitation, Tanza used all her strength to hurl a rock at his chest. Todd raised his left arm to block it, dislocating his shoulder in the process. Just as he swung his axe down to cleave Tanza's small body, Subaru stepped in, pulling the girl out of harm's way and putting himself in her place. Todd expected to see the boy's head fly off, but instead, there was a dull thud, followed by a powerful impact. It was Todd who was sent flying through the air. He landed on his back, stunned, and found himself bleeding. His knees were too weak to hold him up. As he tried to make sense of what had just happened, Subaru told him, "Next time you get close, I'll blow your head off," and flipped him off. Never taking his eyes off Subaru, Todd slowly backed away and disappeared into the smoke. Subaru knew that Todd was at a disadvantage, so he trusted that he wouldn't return. Tanza instantly rushed to his aid, but despite running as fast as she couldn't stop Subaru from collapsing to the ground. You see, Subaru had been dying ever since he jumped from the top of the building with Hein. The fall shattered many of his bones, and using invisible providence overstimulated his brain, further damaging his already dying body. To make matters worse, he hadn't fully blocked Todd's axe. The blade had buried itself in his chest. Subaru had only been able to stand and make that final effort because his body had already given out. All that remained was a final act of resignation before death. When Tanza reached him, she couldn't find the words to speak through her tears, nor did she know what to say. Subaru pulled the black orb from his clothes. He knew it was useless. The world was ending soon. Still, he didn't want to leave her unprotected. With his last remaining strength, he told her that if she kept moving forward, she would eventually find Cecilus, who was likely fighting Arakiya. He could tell she desperately wanted to say something, but he felt it wasn't necessary. After all, she was the one who had helped him remember that the only good thing about him was that he never gave up. Before dying, he told her that he would save everyone. Tanza may have thought those were just the words of a stubborn boy, but she didn't mock him. Instead, she told him that next time, they would definitely win. With that final resolve, Subaru Natsuki's life came to an end. The scene shifts, and we see Todd sitting bored in a carriage driven by a coachman while Arakiya stands guard on top. Todd thinks about how unfair it was that he only had a brief moment to reunite with his fiancée. He regrets lying about avenging his friend because now they're sending him to talk with the governor and deal with the gladiators. He had heard that all he needed to do was retrieve an orb that released a curse. a curse that killed any gladiator who tried to leave the island. Apparently, Groovy, one of the nation's divine generals and one of its strongest individuals, had created the curse. Since the lake was deep, all Todd had to do was toss the orb into the water. Within minutes, the curse would reach every marked gladiator. He just needed to convince the governor, and the job would be done. As they began crossing the bridge to the island, Arakiya remarked that something felt off. Todd saw that all the gladiators, guards, and even the governor were gathered at the entrance, waiting for them. Feeling that things were about to go very wrong, Todd told Arakiya that they needed to turn back immediately. Trusting her subordinate's instincts, she obeyed without question. The only person unhappy about the sudden change of plans was the coachman, but a single sharp glare from Todd was enough to silence him and make him comply. It's said that if the coachman had hesitated even a second longer, Todd would have thrown him into the lake to be devoured by the witch beasts lurking within. On their way back down the path, Todd told Arakiya to prepare to attack the islanders if they tried anything. After all, the fact that they were waiting so openly had to mean that they were being led by someone truly terrifying. When Arakiya asked if they couldn't just defeat that person with her strength, Todd replied that they couldn't beat this enemy, at least not today. Someone said they knew the people in the carriage would turn back, but they hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. After all, there was no way they were going to allow a massacre to unfold inside, which would have resulted in casualties on both sides. Subaru thought this to himself while Tanza reported that the messengers had already left. The girl expressed her relief that they hadn't ended up facing Arakiya as an enemy. Subaru began gently patting her head. Looking at her unharmed body, he felt glad. Glad not to see her covered in wounds or with her horn broken. Thankfully, that hadn't happened in this world. Suddenly, Hyain said it wasn't the time for kids to be flirting with each other. Upon hearing this, Subaru immediately stopped patting Tanza's head and turned to look at Hyain with clear annoyance. Hyain glanced at his friends, hoping for support. However, Idra and White scolded him for bothering Subaru. After scolding the lizardman, his companions just laughed at the silly moment. Subaru watched the scene, thinking that it was fine if he was the only one who remembered what had happened. Lost in that thought, he noticed Idra remark that he had a strange look in his eyes. He replied that he was thinking about how far they'd come. When Whites asked about the next step in the plan, the governor finally arrived. Subaru asked the governor if he now believed in him after what had just happened. The governor responded that following the emperor's order to prepare the gladiators in case of an emergency, he had decided that the time for that emergency had come. For that reason, he was placing all the gladiators and guards in the facility, including himself, under Subaru's command. Whites protested, saying that the gladiators were following Subaru not because of Gustav's orders, but because they had chosen to. The governor replied that, regardless of that, they should remember he still held the cursed sphere, and with it, the means to make them obey Subaru. The story is narrated as Idra and Hyain step in to stop the two from fighting while Subaru looks at the hundreds of gladiators waiting for his orders. Suddenly, he decides it's time to recruit the final gladiator, at which point Cecilus appears. The boy asks why Subaru hasn't recruited him yet. Subaru simply replies that he wanted to see the impatient look on Cecilus's face. He adds that if Cecilus joins him, he'll work hard in return. Knowing Cecilus's personality, Subaru knew better than to show any desire for revenge when bringing him into the fold. That's why he waited until everything had calmed down, until it was time for the main actor to take the stage. Then, he tells Cecilus to stop calling him Basu, knowing the boy would like the sound of the next word. Subaru tells him to start calling him Boss instead. When Cecilus says he likes how that sounds, Subaru explains that it means leader. Now that his entire army is waiting for orders, Subaru declares that it's time to head to the capital and punch his father, the Emperor, in the face. Later, away from everyone else, he speaks privately with Tanza, the only girl who knows the truth behind the lie, and recalling how she once told him that, in a long-lost world, they would win next time. He tells her that, this time, victory is theirs. As the strongest existence, Natsuki Subaru will trample the Wallachian Empire. Before I end the video, I know there will be some lingering questions about this story, and I don't blame you. Although I tried to stay faithful to the original material, I had to make minor adjustments to adapt the narration to a video format. Consider this section a way to address things that might have seemed strange to some viewers. What happened at the end? Why did Subaru reset everything and avoid the final fight? As I mentioned in the video, Subaru's power had been malfunctioning more and more. Proof of this can be found in other stories I've narrated. His ability began to act in ways it never had before. He was aware that something was wrong, but couldn't figure out why. until his conversation with Cecilis and Tansa gave him the final clue. They hinted that the witch, the entity behind his power, had lost sight of him. That's why his return by death points were completely messed up. Now, at the end of the story, he re-establishes his connection with the witch, who sends him back to the last moment she saw him. The very first day Subaru arrived at the Colosseum. This is confirmed in the light novel. After he dies saying goodbye to Tansa, the next scene is Subaru arriving at the island and telling Cecilis that he has a feeling a great story is about to begin. Why is Gustav supporting the Emperor's son when he's trying to overthrow the Emperor Gustav is loyal to? Gustav knows Subaru is a bold child with great leadership qualities. He also knows Subaru is honest and upright to the core. After Subaru resets the loop by reconnecting with the witch, he organizes an uprising and talks with Gustav. They talk about everything, and after a long discussion, Subaru tells Gustav that if he joins the rebellion, Subaru will ensure that history remembers Gustav not as someone who betrayed Emperor Vincent Wallachia. Gustav only had the boy's word to go on, but he chose to believe in him, considering everything Subaru had done up to that point. In hindsight, Subaru was right. During the final war against another witch, the base of the good guys was only saved thanks to the gladiators who chose to follow Subaru. They protected the base from endless waves of zombies that besieged it while Subaru went off with the Emperor to confront the final villain. But that's a story I don't plan to cover. Thanks to the gladiators' defense of the stronghold, the Empire was able to preserve its last bastion during the War of Wallachia. Since Gustav trained those warriors, he will go down in history as one of the war's key figures. Why did I make a ReZero video when I said I wouldn't? I did say that I was burned out on ReZero, and that's still true. However, I also said that I would continue making shorts and doing live streams whenever there were new developments. To be honest, I don't even make the shorts myself anymore. My editor handles those. In the streams, I just review the latest updates before moving on to seasonal anime. While I am still burned out, there were a few topics I had put on hold, waiting for the right moment or motivation to address them. But if you'd like my motivation to return faster, a bit of financial support might do the trick. Don't judge me, guys. I need to save up for a new graphics card. When I launched the donation goals, we hit $35 on the very first day, and this was the video people chose, so I had to get to work on it. There's currently a new goal of $40, so if you'd like to support the release of another ReZero video, any donation will help. I'll personally update the amount received in the Drive link, which will also be in the description. I set the goal at $40 per video because I want to take my time working on other projects outside this universe. That's pretty much it. I don't know if anything is unclear, but I tried to answer the questions I thought might come up. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments, and I'll try to respond to everyone. However, I'd appreciate it if you read this part of the story before asking. Some things can be cleared up just by reading, and I'd like to focus on answering questions that really need an explanation. I want to thank all the channel members, but I want to give a much more special shout out to the donors from this tier. I'd like to thank Mansek, who told me he's been watching the channel for over a year now, and Juan, who was one of the main contributors to the funding goal for the video you just watched. I don't know Alejandro personally, but I'm sure he's an awesome guy. If you like the music in this video, I'll leave a link in the description to my Twitter account. There, you can find all the songs I used. Now tell me, what did you think of this story?